Hello friends, good morning. This is CEC-UGC EduSet network, and we are running a series of lectures on Indian writing in English translation, and this covers the entire area of culture in India from the ancient period to the modern period. And we have already done texts and trends in the ancient period as well as the medieval, and at the moment we are taking up series of the series to the 19th century and the 20th century writing. In this particular sequence, we have today a lecture arranged to discuss Badal Sircar, the famous Indian playwright who wrote in Bangla, and he became a household name in the middle part of the 20th century, and his contribution is unforgettable. For this lecture, we have Dr. Payal Nagpal with us. She teaches English literature in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has done specific study on drama texts, both foreign and Indian. And before I request Dr. Payal Nagpal to speak on the topic, let me tell you, friends, that we have the last 10 minutes of this lecture to be devoted to discussion. If you have any questions to ask, if you have any observations to make, if you have to express some differences, then you are welcome to do so. And that period is from 10:50 onwards to 11 o'clock. So you can call us at this toll-free number. This is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, 1-800-110-430, and you can use this number to approach us to ask questions. So now I welcome Dr. Payal Nagpal. Welcome, and please give your lecture.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Today's lecture is on the plays of the Bengali playwright Badal Sircar, and born in 1925. He was understood to be the proponent of what we call the third theatre, and the third theatre movement was started by Badal Sircar. Before we really go on to understand what Badal Sircar meant by the third theatre, a movement in drama studies that really picked up and spread to other parts of the country, where the concept of the third theatre was adopted, and there were plays that were performed in line with the ideas of the third theatre. We need to understand a couple of ideas about what Badal Sircar meant when he used the term third theatre, and how this third theatre, what is the first and the second idea of theatre against which the idea of the third theatre develops. But just a little bit before that, which is that he advocated a complete rejection of the proscenium theatre, because he felt that to really speaking advocate ideas, the proscenium theatre was not workable, and he moves towards what he calls a more intimate form of theatre. And in 1967, he formed his own group called Shatabdi, and his plays were very, very popular right through the 1970s. A very interesting aspect of the performance of Badal Sircar's plays is that they would never advertise and they would never charge people. So you did not have to pay to go and watch a play by Shatabdi, and there would be no advertisements and so on. So this in a sense meant that a complete commercialization of theatre, as we see around today, that was totally done away with by Badal Sircar, and it's really heartening to see that there were so many plays that the group had performed, and the fact that they never charged. Donations, of course, were accepted, but there were no charges as such. So these ideas are in fact very well expressed in a play which makes use of fantasy by Badal Sircar, which is called Beyond the Land of Hattamala. So resistance to this commercialization is very, very important, and the composition of the audience in Badal Sircar's plays is also very, very significant, because he is not looking at a very elitist audience. He is looking at the ordinary people. He is not so in that sense also a kind of commercialization of drama is totally rejected, where it is not contributing to the way we understand it to be in terms of high culture, but it is contributing to the development of a genuine sort of culture, as one should understand it. And third theatre, really speaking, then is not just a theatre movement or a performative practice movement started by Badal Sircar. It is also a way of really speaking, understanding, what is the real function of theatre. So it makes us think, what is the role that theatre is supposed to play in society. So a very interesting aspect about Badal Sircar was that he was by training a civil engineer, and he was into town planning and urban planning, and these factors, in a sense, do kind of relate to, I wouldn't say determine, but relate to the way he develops his concept of theatre and the way in which the performance is supposed to take place. And he had traveled to different parts of the world, and he'd been to Nigeria, he'd been to the Eastern European countries, and where of course he was familiar with Grotowski's style of putting up plays. He was also influenced by Richard Schechner. So in the 1970s, a period during which his idea of the third theatre, really speaking, picks up. So the group performed many plays, and they performed initially at a place called the Angan Manch, which seated about 80 to 100 people. And however, soon they had to leave this space. And it's interesting to mark that in 1973, they passed this resolution that they are not going to perform on the proscenium stage. And they also decided not to use any props. So in a sense, from putting up plays that did kind of deal with, the proscenium and a certain kind of audience, Badal Sircar soon moves on to putting up plays that are meant not only, which are a combination in a sense of the Angan Manch and the Mukt Manch in the open theatre, but also plays that were meant for the ordinary people. And in that context, he said that, when people can't come and watch these plays, let us go to them. So the movement kind of went into different villages, and plays would be put up there. And again, the fact that people were not going to be charged was very important here. So there is a kind of live communication that Badal Sircar looks at, and when he talks about this intimate theatre or a kind of live communication, this communication works at all levels, and there are all these levels. The 4 levels that he lists are that there is a kind of a communication that takes place between the performer and the spectator. That would be one. There would be a communication that takes place between the performers. That would be a second kind of communication. And then there would be a communication between the spectator to the performer. So performer to spectator is one part, whether what the performance is in a sense kind of acting on the mind of the audience, and then the response of the spectator in a sense can also influence the performer. And then of course spectator to spectator. For instance, people watching a play together, passing comments, and the idea of laughter or maybe even at times anger that could be generated. So spectator to spectator is another kind of communication, just as performer to performer. So 4 different levels that he talks about. Then, in fact, for instance, the kind of stage space that is to be there in the play called Mitchell, which is the most popular, most translated and performed of Badal Sircar's plays. So in it, the idea of a stage that kind of runs like a maze through the space of the audience is very, very interesting, and that's a second aspect that we are going to discuss shortly. So this is, as he says, this is an intimate theatre, and the language of this theatre involves being within and experiencing, not viewing and hearing from a separate sanctum at a distance, which means the whole idea of, in fact, Badal Sircar discusses this in great detail in an essay called The Third Theatre, which is that naturalistic theatre and the way it kind of creates this division between the space of the actors and the space of the spectators. So that is something that is collapsed in the context of the third theatre, because taking on from his experience of having seen many plays abroad and working with other directors, the whole idea of theatre in the round that he sees in the West is translated into his idea of the open theatre or the Mukt Manch that he kind of starts in the context of the third theatre. another very important aspect of Badal Sircar's acting style, in a sense, in the context of third theatre, is the human body. So, for instance, in a lot of plays, there is no effort to kind of, for instance, if a forest has to be depicted, or if a bridge has to be depicted, for instance, in Bertolt Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle, which the group had performed. So if the bridge had to be depicted, then people would get together, immediately form a bridge, or people would get together and form a tree. So the human body in this sense is a very, very important and central aspect in a sense of third theatre. And when, to get back to the question that was just raised, which is about what then is the function of theatre, then this idea of spreading awareness, of encouraging people to think about the world that they live in and to ask more questions. I think this is a central point that the third theatre makes. And here again, I would request Professor Prakash to share his views on third theatre.
It is definitely while that the play is revolutionary in the sense, that the people, the masses, who are supposed to affect the world, influence the world, make the world, those people are brought into the domain of stage,
yes,
domain of the play. And it's really very exciting to hear that such a playwright was there who actually performed. He didn't write, he didn't communicate that way. He would in fact ask people, performers, and of course you are also one of them. Yeah. So this kind of mutuality is unthinkable in the present circumstances, unless one goes to playwrights like this. So this is the kind of play that belongs to the people.
Yes.
So I would agree with you that this should be emphasized, yes, and you're rightly doing it.
Yes, and in fact, to talk about the fact that he writes these plays and so on. So he's more of a practitioner, a theatre practitioner in that sense. And this process of writing the plays, when one reads plays by Badal Sircar, and these are scripts and that were performed.
Can you explain the difference between practitioner and a writer?
Yes. So the reason why I'm saying that Badal Sircar is more of a theatre practitioner, because when one reads these scripts, I mean, today we talk a lot about performativity and so on. So when we look at the plays in their written form, in their published form, one can see that these are plays that are meant not to be read, but they are plays that are meant to be performed.
Which means the idea is that the playwright thinks that action belongs to the masses, they produce the action, and that action actually is brought to the stage.
Yes, and that action is inherent in the script itself. It is there are plays that one would read and put them at rest, and however these are plays that are meant to be performed, and that sense is quite evident in the script itself. And one reads these plays and they're published, and now most translations are available. For instance, Michel translated as Procession, and then there's Bhoma, there's Tale News, these 3 plays dealing with Calcutta and so on. So that sense that these are plays that are to be performed, that is absolutely inherent in the script.
It's very difficult to think of a script then. Is script fixed? Is the script frozen? Or is the script made on the stage?
It's not, if I just restrict myself for a moment to the published form, so written form, it is a script that is extremely dynamic. It is not frozen, and one can see, for instance, I mean, the characters are they never have names. So it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh. So 6 comes in, at times 5 comes in. So and one can see that every production will be a different production, because it will depend on where 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are placed, and where is 5 coming from, and where is 4 coming from, and how this kind of scene is being created on stage.
It's a kind of a market scene.
Absolutely.
People come and go, and they are replaced by others.
Yes, and in fact, in most plays, the sense of the road is very, very interesting, and it's also it brings to my mind, at least, also if we just go back in time, then ancient classical European classical drama, then the Greek and the Roman plays, this idea of a very narrow stage with the road and doors opening into the streets. That kind of sense is there, and one can see that Badal Sircar, of course, in the 20th century is creating a very, very new idiom in theatre. And the script certainly is not a frozen script. It is a very dynamic script, and it is just to read it is a very tiny part of it. but one has to imagine, one has to visualize how these scenes are going to be performed.
So now we have to redefine theatre.
Yes.
And it's not drama then, it's theatre, it's
theatre.
practice, as you say.
Yes. In fact, that's one of the things that I think Badal Sircar's, even the interesting part is that even reading the play makes us realize that the reading part of it is very, very small. One has to push oneself to understand, one's mind to understand that what is theatre all about? What is the stage space all about? And is the stage space only the proscenium stage, or are we looking at things beyond it? And all these ideas, these are questions that the script itself raises. Almost every script pushes us to kind of think in this manner. And there is no essentialization of plot, there's no story as such that one can take away. These are ideas, there are processes, social processes that are a part of the play that is written. So
very interesting. Yes.
And so when we talk about the third theatre, then there are these two kinds of theatre, that Badal Sircar, to begin with, finds around him. One is folk theatre, and the other is theatre that emerges from the city, which he says is more akin to theatre that comes from the West. Now, these two kinds of theatre, when we really speaking look at them, then according to Badal Sircar, folk theatre had ideas that were not really speaking progressive in the sense that the theatre from the city really speaking had. So some of the ideas could also be reactionary, they could be backward, they could be sterile. So however, city theatre did touch upon progressive ideas, but the audience was way too sophisticated to understand the real import of these ideas. So which meant that if we look at folk theatre and when we look at city theatre, both were hugely deficient in a certain way. For instance, the folk theatre, which for him is the first theatre, was indigenous. But the ideas that this form propagated, these ideas were not progressive ideas. These ideas were not forward-looking in that sense. Where the second theatre, a lot of it from the theatre from the West, it could be proscenium theatre, where it did present ideas that were forward-looking, that were futuristic, yet the audience had a huge gap in kind of understanding how these how what was being presented on stage will translate into real life. So this is where Badal Sircar advocates what he calls a third theatre, which he sees as a theatre of synthesis, which means that for Sircar, the idea of the form of theatre, the structure in which it is placed, and at the same time the ideas that are being placed within a certain structure, the way these ideas are then transmitted to the audience, the composition of the audience, all these factors are very, very important, which takes us back to the point just made about the four kinds of relationships that exist, from performer to spectator, between the performers, from spectator to performer, and amongst the spectators, which again brings us to another important idea, which is that the spectator is a very, very important part of this kind of theatre. And the idea is to make the spectator think about a lot of the issues that are raised in the course of the performance. So from folk theatre and city theatre, which Sircar finds deficient, we move to the idea of the third theatre, which is a theatre of synthesis. If we look at some aspects of this third theatre, one of the most important aspects is that of flexibility. The idea that the plays can be performed anywhere. So be it a small space, be it the countryside, be it an open area in the village, any space is space that can be used to put up a play. The second idea that is put forth in third theatre is portability, in the sense that the fact that the group decided not to use any props, not to lay emphasis on costumes or lights in a certain manner. So these plays, the troupe just had to carry themselves. They did not have to carry any baggage with them. And the idea of then implementing third theatre by moving from, let's say, one village to another, one state to another, this became a real possibility. For instance, if they were to actually think in terms of props and costumes and so on, the idea of a quick move from one village to another, or a state to another, would then be slightly difficult. So of course, with this came a related idea, which was that the cost, really speaking, of putting a production came down, because there were no props or costumes that were specific to the play that were used. So the dependency, in a sense, of theatre, of this kind of theatre, on money was reduced greatly. And to go back to the ideals that Badal Sircar had put forth right at the beginning, which is that even before this formation of Shatabdi, was that these plays would not be advertised, and the audience will not be charged. So which meant that anyone who wished to could go and watch the play. And there's this interesting incident that's recounted in one of the performances. At the end of the performance, so donations were of course collected. So these two people carried a towel, and they asked people for donations, and they did not go to this woman who was in rags, and because they thought that she might not be able to pay. However, this woman who was in rags, an old woman, she called them and she put 5 paise on the towel. So this kind of a contribution is very, very interesting, and one is of course looking at the 70s. So then another very significant aspect of the kind of plays, what we were just discussing about the fact that the plays by Badal Sircar, when we read them, one can see that there is a need to visualize them, to imagine them, to watch the performance. And these are plays that are meant not to be restricted to books alone, but these are plays that have to be watched by the people. So one of the central aspects then of the third theatre is that there is no sense of a story or a plot that one will take back, but there are processes in society that are being highlighted. There are processes in society that are being described, and these are described not through dialogue which is very lengthy, or dialogue that goes on from for a page or two, but these are dialogues that are very crisp. These are short dialogues, and at times rapid conversation that is happening amongst and a lot of characters. It's not as if there are just 1 or 2 people, but a lot of characters that are there. So 5 or 6 people who are there, and there is a kind of quick conversation that is taking place, and this quick conversation draws attention to the kind of processes that are taking place in society. And as mentioned, that these characters generally speaking, don't have names. Even when they do have names, for example, if we think about Procession, the name Khoka is the small one, and then there is an old man. So the old man could be any old man. And Khoka here is also somebody who's always been there. So Khoka is not somebody who's a specific character who has a specific lifespan. In fact, Khoka is the one he's emblematic, symptomatic of somebody who's been killed, who continues to be, in that sense, killed in the society. So these scripts then are performative, hugely performative, because depending on the audience, depending on the space in which it is being performed, the play can, really speaking, acquire very new meaning, absolutely new meaning from one performance to the other.
Dr. Nagpal, can you explain the idea of processes? What are processes in this case?
For instance, there's a play that deals with the history of India. So there he's talking about the process of imperialism, for instance, and that is done through a history class that is taking place. So there are teachers and their dialogues are there, and there are students and their dialogues are there, and through it and through these very, very short dialogues, and of course there's a character called Britannia, and Britannia of course represents the empire in that sense, the British Empire. But so the process of imperialism is, in a sense, it's a counter to the way it is generally understood. So even when the idea that it was, in a sense, good for a certain kind of physical development or topographical development that takes place in the country, he counters all these ideas, and he does that through the classroom and through very, very short dialogues, which is I think a very interesting and a very difficult task, because one would generally want to kind of specify and mention in detail the counter narrative.
So in a way he is teaching the people
Yes.
to think,
Yes.
then reject ideas Of course, he would reject ideas, but then he would bring in new ideas.
He's bringing in new ideas, and he's making people think about these new ideas, which is why I specifically use the term social processes. So then again, when he thinks about characters who are on the margins, be it the farmers, be it the workers, so what are the processes at work there, and why are these people on the margins? So he really unfolds all that. So presenting a kind of counter narrative is, in a sense, very central to Badal Sircar's plays.
Which means there is no story, there are no characters, there are no situations, but processes.
Yes.
In that sense,
Yes.
there is an idea. That idea is supposed to evolve with the help of the actors on the stage and also the audience.
Yes.
I see.
So the spectator is a very important part of this process. So, which is why the term, these are scripts that, are performative scripts, and because these characters, really speaking, do not have a kind of name, or there is no specific plot line. So, if at all, for instance, if how would one make out, for instance, this play on history, Indian History Made Easy, is the title of the play. So for this particular play, if Britannia had to be depicted and costumes are not going to be used, props are not going to be used, so there would just be maybe a little chart paper pinned on the back saying Britannia. So characters could, just simply be wearing labels of who they represent. So he says that, we found, Badal Sircar's own words, we found that a third theatre which is neither restricted by the costly and often immobile paraphernalia of the conventional proscenium theatre, nor infested by the commerciality and outdated values of the folk theatre, for instance Jatra, is not only a necessity but a possibility. So he says the third theatre, and he rejects both forms actually, he rejects both the folk and the city form, because the city form, the theatre in the city, he says, is all about the proscenium, and it is immobile, because when one imagines putting up a play in an auditorium on the proscenium, then one is imagining only a certain kind of performance which will be watched by a very, very small group of people. So the need to take the ideas that are put up in theatre, the need to take them from outside, from inside the auditorium to out on the streets, is something that third theatre does. And it also makes us think that is it enough to put up a play? Is it enough to just put up a play which is, as Sircar himself says, that is watched by an elitist audience? Or is theatre to kind of, in a sense, he restores the dignity to theatre. He restores its function, its original function of communication, of providing entertainment, of reaching out to people. So this reaching out and this process of communication, in a sense, cannot be restricted to the proscenium and the auditorium space. So he says, and which is why he says that this kind of theatre, the naturalistic theatre which is on the proscenium, is something that is immobile, it is expensive, it has paraphernalia, because one would then want to kind of put up a naturalistic setting, and he's strictly against this kind of a naturalistic performance. And at the same time, he also rejects the outdated values, as he says, of what he calls the jatra or the folk theatre.
Now, Dr. Nagpal, I think you have given us the idea regarding the tradition which is supposed to be rejected by him, and he is making a new kind of attempt to make things understandable for the benefit of the audience. I think this is a kind of theatre that will go a long way in the making of consciousness in our country. And we viewers, with this we come to the end of the first part of the lecture, and the second part will soon start, and Dr. Nagpal will be there to extend these ideas further. So thank you, and please wait for the second part. Welcome back, friends, and we come to the second part of the lecture. And already we have discussed the general idea of the kind of theatre that Badal Sircar brought in for the benefit of the audience. And now I would request Dr. Payal Nagpal to give some examples from his dramatic practice. So please give it.
So, to take on from what we were discussing in the previous lecture, which is that Badal Sircar, through the third theatre, rejects both the first and the second form, where he finds both of them, rejects in the sense that he finds them hugely deficient. According to him, the folk theatre is deficient in terms of ideas, and the ideas are outdated, and the theatre that can be seen in the city is a proscenium theatre, which he finds extremely restrictive. So, in rejecting these two, he takes on also the better parts of these two practices, and he then looks at it as a theatre of synthesis, which he calls the third theatre, and which he sees also at a very at another level. He sees it as a very important rural-urban link. He says that this is the third theatre is the way ahead. It's the way forward, as it will help us, kind of bring these two contexts together. So in that sense, theatre of synthesis, not only in terms of theatrical practices, but theatre of synthesis also in terms of a rural-urban link. The dependence on the human body is a very important part of it. The idea that the human body remains a central part of the performance that is to take place on stage. Another very significant aspect, we've been talking about how the spectator is very, very important in third theatre. So in plays like Spartacus, for instance, that were put up, to begin with, there was this apprehension that maybe in the rural areas people might not understand some of these ideas and people might not take to it. But the response that Spartacus received, that's when Badal Sircar realized that to assume that they will respond better to a jatra and, let's say, not to a Spartacus in the third theatre would be a false notion, and at times, in fact, they responded better than the urban intelligentsia. So this idea that they might not do that is really a misplaced notion, and one needs to kind of abandon that. So the theatrical experience of the spectator is also very, very important. So not only what the spectator thinks, be it a spectator-spectator relationship or from the spectator to the performer, but the experience that the spectator undergoes is very important, and more important in a sense than what he calls the narration of the story, so to say. And a very important part of the third theatre, as Badal Sircar himself says, is honest theatre. The fact that theatre has to be honest to itself, unto itself, which is why I think third theatre, really speaking, not only shows us the way ahead, but also restores to the kind of dignity that that theatre has. So, and I quote from one of his works, "Fakery for the sake of impressing the audience has no place in this theatre, nor is it required, for it does not depend on the box office for survival," quote unquote. So he says to be fake, to put up an idea just because it's a popular, fashionable idea, or one is trying to impress the audience. He says these ideas have no place in third theatre, because they do not depend on the box office for survival, because there is no money that they are, in a sense, kind of charging people. The whole give and take of the commercial aspect is something that is totally ruled out. So, if you look at the plays that he kind of puts up on Calcutta, for instance, there is a play. There are these three that form a kind of series. It's different. They are connected in terms of the fact that they deal with Calcutta and they deal with West Bengal, but these are also plays that are created in a kind of collage sort of a fashion. So, for instance, Mitchell, which is translated as a procession, then there is Bhoma, then there is Bhasi Khabar or stale news. So this itself forms a kind of collage on Calcutta, especially if one looks at Mitchell, which, as I mentioned, is one of the most performed and translated of Badal Sircar's plays. So Calcutta is looked at as a city of processions. So Mitchell, in that sense, is really speaking something that analyzes this idea of the procession, procession for everything. So where does it take one? And but before we get to the play, a very important aspect of this is the instructions that are given right at the beginning of the play, and there's a little diagram actually that is given, which is that of a maze. If we look at the stage instructions, Badal Sircar mentions, procession is not meant to be performed on the proscenium stage. It has to be staged in an open space with the audience seated all around or on the floor of a large room. If performed indoors, the chairs and backless benches for the audience should be so arranged as to suggest a maze, with the road going in knots and rounds. The road will constitute the acting area, with the audience sitting on both sides, the way people stand on both sides of a street to watch a procession passing. The actors will have two entrances or exits. So it means that if we look at the construction of the stage, it is certainly not the proscenium stage, where there is a dividing line, an invisible dividing line between the space of the audience and the performer's space. We are also not looking at the open air space in its conventional form, but there is a crisscrossing that has happened. The roads are going to cut through the audience space, which means that the performer is going to be performing right in the midst of the audience. So, and this is how the audience will be on both sides of the road, and the performer will be performing on the road. So, apart from the fact that, of course, this creates a new concept of the stage, a new concept of performance, it's also, it takes us back to understanding the point that Badal Sircar makes about the theatrical experience. So the theatrical experience in this case would be very, very interesting when we look at a play like Procession, because the audience would then be not only watching the procession, but the audience would also be a part of the procession in that sense, because they are right next to that road and on both sides. So the idea of the street on which there is a procession that is passing by and people are standing on both sides is well captured through this construction of the stage. So in fact, if we look at a kind of use of dialogue, and we look at this kind of state space and so on, at times a lot of the conventions that are there in absurd theatre, for instance, are used, but not to confuse or not to arrive at no meaning, but to arrive at meaning, to make the spectator more aware, in a sense, of the real conditions of existence. That, really speaking, is the idea. So if in Procession, for instance, there is a chorus, there is a coca, there is an old man, and dialogue is slightly abstract, and yet it carries a kind of concreteness. For instance, if we look at the lines by Coca, and I'm using these lines because Coca is a character who's mentioned, has a name, and yet his dialogues defy that name. It's not an individual. The old man, of course, can be any old man. So these are Coca's lines. I was killed. I, me, here I am. They killed me. I'm dead. I was killed just now. I was killed today. I was killed yesterday. So in a sense, Coca becomes symptomatic of the ordinary man. It could be anybody. And of course, Coca also defies a kind of time span. So it doesn't have a beginning and an end, but has been there and is communicating with the old man, is wondering what kind of procession is going to pass, what is the road that is going to lead to some sort of meaning. And for the most, Coca says that there is no sense of meaning that can be derived. So now, in all of this, there are all these other characters, for instance, numbered from 1 to 6, for instance. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So there is a section on news, how news is constantly being churned out, how things are constantly being sold. There is a moment of the independence of India. There is the moment of the partition. So Michel, in that sense, he raises this idea and this question that all day long people worked, not enough to eat, so they were all equal. Surplus brought civilization. Production is on the increase. Wealth is on the increase. So when we talk about processes that are at work in society, through this kind of dialogue, these processes are brought to the fore in front of the audience through this idea of the procession. That to begin with, if you look at the history of civilization, to begin with, people worked and there was not enough to eat, so everybody was equal. Then there came the idea of the surplus, and surplus brought with itself the idea of civilization. And production continues to increase and wealth also continues to increase. Now this is kind of interspersed with the discourse of the master. And the master says that there is heaven for you after you die. So these two ideas are put together, and it's not as if the playwright or the performers are arriving at conclusions, but the juxtaposition of these ideas is something that is going to make the audience ask the relevant questions. And this is of course done through this whole idea of the procession. So in the last part, for instance, the old man says that the procession shows us a way, the way home. And Koka, of course, is pessimistic because he says that he has seen many processions and they never really speaking show the way. And it's always, the same road and so on. However, the old man, and suddenly he changes this notion, changes this idea, and at the end he says that there seems to be a procession, a real procession. And who comprises this real procession? It is the men. So in the men in the idea of human beings, that there is a genuine, in a sense, getting together. There is a genuine coming together of men in what Koka at the end of the play understands to be a real procession. So again, close to this is Bhoma. Bhoma is again, not a play that is, he says, just before the play, he says, Bhoma is not a play aiming to entertain the well-dressed front row audience in a lush theatre. I'm sure those who do that kind of theatre will not touch my play anyway. So Badal Sircar, he is very, very clear about what is the kind of audience that his plays are looking for, who are his plays meant for, and what is he attacking. Everything is presented very clearly. And if we ask the question, Bhoma is a person. So who is Bhoma? Bhoma can be the forest, it is a paddy field, it is the village, it is the jungle, the cornfield, and so on. And Badal Sircar talks about Bhoma because he says 3/4 of India's population lives in villages, and there are millions and millions of Bhomas. And he says in the cities we live on the blood of Bhoma. So, he says that while people are struggling for basics and people in the villages are struggling for, let's say, fertilizers and so on, so there is another discourse that takes place in the city of a kind of development, a kind of modernity, of people kind of wanting to move forward. So, these ideas also tie up with what is kind of discussed in Mitchell, in Procession, the whole idea of surplus. So,
I see here a kind of movement, between the idea and its, implication for reality. Initially it was imperialism or it was the procession, but now from those has come the idea of inequality.
yes.
Inequality is not just an idea; it's a kind of reality. So maybe the idea changes into reality, and then that brings people closer to the play. So
that is absolutely right. And Badal Sircar is not only depicting that reality, presenting that reality, which is part of what he calls an intimate theatre, or rather lived theatre, a lived experience, the theatrical experience. But he's also making, by raising questions, he's making the audience think about this reality. For instance, if there is inequality, just presenting that inequality would not be enough for third theatre or Badal Sircar. But why is the inequality there? And there are enough ideas and hints that are thrown in the play to kind of make the audience pick up these ideas and discuss it amongst themselves and ask,
what is surplus, for instance?
What is surplus, for instance?
How surplus, increases inequality.
Yes.
And then there's a possibility that this inequality can be decreased or completely done away with.
Completely done away with.
I see.
So, in fact, there's the next play that I was going to discuss is a very, very simple play. It's a play that's actually meant for children. And it's called Beyond the Land of Hathamala. And it totally reminds us of Thomas More's Utopia. the ideal world where nothing is bought and nothing is sold. And so if you're hungry, so you go to a place and you eat the food. If you need clothes, you go to a store and you just pick up the clothes.
And how do you produce?
So everybody is working, so they work very hard for a certain part of the year, and only that much work is required. The rest of the time people don't need to work. They enjoy the fruits of what everybody produces collectively. So there are these two thieves who land up in this ideal space, and every time they ask that, but how much do we have to pay for it, because they are thieves and they don't have the money. So they say, oh, you must be from Hattamala, we've heard about you from our grandmother's stories. So this is, which means that the idea of buying and selling in grandmother's stories means that these are old ideas now. This space that he talks about, that Badal Sircar presents through a kind of fantasy in Beyond the Land of Hattamala, that is the road ahead. That is the future where nothing is in a sense being bought and nothing is being sold, and everything is shared and is collectively produced.
In fact, buying and selling is inhuman.
Yes.
What is human is sharing. So he is in a way introducing the idea of sharing and rejecting the idea of buying and selling.
Yes, and this is a play that's actually meant for children. Very simple language, very basic language. And in fact, the reason I said that, it reminds me totally of Thomas More's Utopia is that so these are thieves and they want gold and silver. So they say there is a library from where you can issue expensive things and you can wear them for as long as you want. So they say, but the gold and silver, is it kept locked? So the people say, no, these are ordinary things, why should they be kept locked?
So if in society there is gold and if there is something good, then there are thieves.
There are thieves.
Okay, gold and thieves are, in that case, inseparable.
Yes, but here the interesting part is that in the library, anybody can go to the library. What is precious is the books, the maps, old documents. These are kept under lock and keys for fear that somebody might damage them in kind of pulling them out. That is knowledge. And the gold and the silver is left on open racks. Because and in fact, so these thieves ask that, so don't people ask for gold and silver? They say no. When fresh flower ornaments are there, why would people ask for gold and silver? In fact, they say that, it is only the old women probably who would ask for, and he says that, which means that these are all ideas related to gold and silver, ideas that are regressive. These are old-fashioned ideas. So the road ahead is totally different. So in fact, I'll just read this very interesting quotation from the play, where one of the characters says, whatever we need in this world, whatever we can make it, all if we work together. We'll work our best indeed and take whatever we need. Come, let's share everything together. Why go on shopping rampages? Why do we slave for mere wages? We'll share what we have together. The play ends on this note. And as mentioned that, this is a play that is actually meant for children. So the use of fantasy, the use of simple ideas about how two thieves are actually, they are about to drown and they suddenly reach this place and they do not know what to make of it because they're very hungry. They get the best food, they get the most exotic of fruits, they get everything that they need. And these thieves are skilled in making holes in the wall through which they generally enter. So at the end of the play, there is a doctor in the play who tells them that, they can undergo some kind of training. And they can impart their skill of creating these holes in the wall, either by working as a mason or by working as an architect and so on. So one of them actually decides to, is very impressed by the way flowers are being planted. So he says he's going to make these perfect holes in the ground into which these flowers can be planted, and the other of course wants to build. So how they're in this kind of space, how their the idea of theft is then translated into a skill and is made into something more constructive. So when we, with this we move on to another play by Badal Sircar, which is called Indian History Made Easy. And again, if it is a play that is put up in front of school students or college students, the play would acquire new meaning depending on where and how it is performed. So for instance, the imperial powers represented by Britannia brings to fore the whole idea of how capital, of how money is taken from India and is kind of used by the colonizers. So Britannia says, and this is a question, how could the factories be set up without capital? If the factories aren't set up, how can the inventions be used? So Britannia says that it's not as if inventions were not there earlier. Inventions were there earlier also. However, these inventions could not have been translated into capital. So the whole idea being that with colonization, enough capital was generated so that these inventions, so to say, that were taking place in the West could then be used in factories to generate more and more. So, understood, you fools, Britannia says, now my precious son is bringing gold and silver from India. My banks are swelling, investing money. What's the worries about factories now? And imperialism then through like one word dialogue is described as revenue, plunder, business, profit, money, capital, invention, industry. So one word, and this kind of continuous dialogue that goes on. There is discussion about taxation so that Indian goods were then not sold in the pre-independence period in Britain, and how the factories totally finished in places like Murshidabad and Surat and so on. So and a discussion of permanent settlement and how then the Indian market would be used only to kind of export raw material to the colonizers' country. So, and these are ideas, and of course, we know that when we compare third theatre, the one name that will instantly come to mind is Bertolt Brecht, and how Brecht's epic theatre is what would have probably inspired Badal Sircar to, reimagine theatre in India. So, in a sense, Badal Sircar's contribution to, theatre in India, the kind of plays that he had put up, and the ease and accessibility, I think that's very, very important, because there are enough number of times that we pick up scripts that are there, and when we try to put them up on stage, the sheer fact that one would require a huge cast, a lot of props, elaborate costumes, that becomes a dampener and prevents us from kind of thinking about the performance of that particular play, which might otherwise be very good. So one of the strongest points of third theatre is that you need only two things: you need the actors and you need the performers, and you need, of course, just any space will do, and the performance can happen there. So if we just look at the 4 or 5 plays that we looked at today very briefly, so be it social processes, be it imperialism, be it the fantasy land which is beyond Hathamala, where people live on equal terms, whether it is Bhoma, who represents the completely marginalized, at times farmer, at times worker, who's struggling for basics in his life, or the idea of the procession, and finally the need for a procession of real people, real men. So,
is there an emphasis on women here somewhere?
That is something that even, in the plays that I read, there is, in one of the plays, there is a reference to, this actress who's there and so on. And however, for the most, I think it would be unfair to actually say that Badal Sircar is not concentrating on problems related to women, because I think what he's doing is he's looking at these social processes and he's looking at both men and women that are involved. So something that is totally separate and is based only on the issues related to women is
the home, relationship between one person and another, friendship. These things
go missing also because of the context that he's talking about. He's talking about margins, he's talking about the villages. So there is then another play, for instance, Stale News, which is on the Santhal rebellion, and where there is mention of women and so on, but a play that focuses entirely on women. I think for him, women are as much a part of the society as are the men. So he sees the issues that are there are issues related to both.
Basically, I think he is focusing upon the economic issues, and for him, economic issues are central. Which is correct.
Yes.
Without the economic issues being central, one can't think of all these things that we have.
Yes, because
and the relationship will follow.
relationship.
So, and that will be another story. But so far as Badal Sircar is concerned, he's talking about the social problems that exist in front of him, and he's talking about them. And I think he's based in Calcutta. He's based in West Bengal. So he's talking about class struggle all the time.
He's talking about class struggle all the time, because for him, and which is why I say that it would be unfair to say that, you know, he's not. Maybe there might be one or two plays where he discusses women's issues separately, but the point is his major emphasis, the central aspect is the class struggle. The central aspect is about reasons for inequality, and how what is the road ahead, and how he's kind of asking people to think about these issues.
But
and
indirectly, he's also talking about the family. The family will become family only when these issues have been sorted out, the economic issues.
Yes.
Till that time, people can't relate with one another. They'll be 1, 2, 3. They won't have names.
In fact, he's going way ahead, and he's saying that till these problems are sorted out, the basic human dignity is not there. So this division of the sexes, and division in terms of problems related to gender, according to him, we've not really arrived there, because the economic inequality is so high that to really speaking move ahead without solving this problem is really problematic for him.
So he's talking about the India at present.
Yes.
When it's dealing with issues of hunger. Issues of illiteracy and all those things.
Yes.
I see.
In fact, this one very interesting thing that he had to say in what was the Abul Kalam Azad memorial lecture in 1981, so fairly recent, he says, payment of and he says this about his idea of third theatre, that payment of money need not be a condition of entry. This is very important, not just because most of the people in this country cannot afford to pay the price of the tickets, but principally because a human act like theatre should let people meet freely on the basis of equal status, so that their relationship can be human. So theatre becomes a way for him to arrive at this idea of humanity, and he sees a theatrical performance as a human act, and the basis, he says, is equality. So what he's looking for is relationships that are humane in form, and third theatre strives very hard to do that. And I should say that it really speaking succeeds in kind of raising a lot of these questions.
Thanks, Dr. Payal Nagpal, for this lecture on Badal Sircar, which is focused upon the third theatre. And the third theatre is that which is not actually there in the country at the moment, because theatre does not go beyond entertaining people. And this person says, well, you can entertain, but first talk about ideas that are relevant. So friends, we have had this lecture which introduces a different kind of theatre, and rightly it has been called the third theatre, perhaps from the third world that we have. Yes. So thank you, Dr. Payal Nagpal. You've given a very new idea about theatre and its activity. And viewers, you can mull all of these ideas, you can think about these ideas, and later on you might get back and then raise these questions around yourself, or you can perhaps share those questions with us. So with this, we come to the end of the lecture today. Thanks.